June 23, 1941. Outside WWII, Lithuania, Hauptmann Wilhelm von Hohenbein stood beside his Panzer III and watched through binoculars as his company's anti-tank guns fired repeatedly at a single Soviet tank blocking the road ahead. The tank would not die. For 2 days, this lone T-34 had held up an entire German battle group. Artillery shells had scarred its armor. Anti-tank rounds had bounced off its sloped glacis plate. The crew inside kept fighting. They destroyed 12 German tanks, prevented the advance of an entire Kampfgruppe, and died only when German engineers crawled close enough under darkness to drop grenades through the hatches. When von Hohenbein finally approached the knocked-out tank and examined the armor, he found dozens of impact marks. Not penetrations. Impact marks. His division's standard 37 mm anti-tank gun, which had destroyed Polish, French and British tanks with ease, had done nothing but scratch the paint. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had begun 48 hours earlier. Von Hohenbein's company had already lost more tanks to this single Soviet vehicle than they had lost in the entire French campaign. What he was looking at would become the most feared tank on the Eastern Front. Not because it was the most sophisticated, not because it had the biggest gun, but because it combined the 3 qualities that mattered most in mechanized warfare: survivability, mobility, and overwhelming numbers. The Germans had just encountered the T-34. They would spend the next 4 years trying desperately to counter it. They would fail. The nightmare had only begun. The mathematics of disbelief German intelligence had failed catastrophically. Before Barbarossa, Wehrmacht analysts had documented Soviet tank production and capabilities. They knew about the T-26, a light tank based on British designs. They knew about the BT-7, fast but lightly armored. They knew about the multi-turreted T-35, impressive but mechanically unreliable. They did not know about the T-34. The tank had entered production in 1940. By June 1941, the Soviets had manufactured approximately 1,200 T-34s. German intelligence estimated Soviet tank strength at around 10,000 vehicles, which was accurate. But they assumed these were all obsolete models. The presence of a modern, well-designed medium tank in such numbers was not anticipated. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored doctrine, wrote in his memoir Panzer Leader about his first encounter with the T-34 near Mtsensk in October 1941. His words captured the shock rippling through German tank units. The Russian T-34 tank is the best tank in the world. Our tanks are inferior to it in armor, armament, and especially in cross-country performance. The T-34's sloped armor gives it effective protection, far superior to its actual thickness. Our 50 mm anti-tank gun can only penetrate it at dangerously close range, usually under 500 meters, and then only with flank or rear shots. This was not hyperbole from a frontline tanker. This was the father of Blitzkrieg, admitting that German armor was outclassed. The technical specifications explained why. The T-34 model 1941 mounted a 76.2 mm main gun, the F-34, which could penetrate 60 mm of armor at 1,000 meters. The Panzer III, Germany's main battle tank in 1941, mounted a 50 mm gun that could barely penetrate 40 mm at the same range. The Panzer IV carried a short-barreled 75 mm gun, designed for infantry support, not tank combat. But the gun was not the T-34's most devastating feature. The armor was. The slope that changed everything. Soviet designers had borrowed a principle from naval architecture and applied it to tank design: sloped armor. The T-34's front glacis plate sat at a 60-degree angle from vertical. The hull sides angled at 40 degrees. Even the turret, cast in a single piece, had rounded surfaces that deflected incoming rounds. The physics were brutal for German gunners. A 45 mm thick plate, angled at 60 degrees, provided protection equivalent to 90 mm of vertical armor. Rounds striking at oblique angles would ricochet harmlessly into the air or skip along the surface, losing energy without penetrating. German tankers had trained against targets with vertical armor. The T-34's geometry was alien. They aimed at the glacis plate, fired, and watched their rounds bounce off. They aimed at the turret and saw sparks as shells glanced away. Only side and rear shots at close range offered reliable penetration. But getting close to a T-34 meant entering its kill zone. Lieutenant Otto Carius, a Tiger tank ace who survived the war with 150-plus tank kills, described his early encounters with T-34s while commanding a Panzer 3018, a Czechoslovak-designed light tank pressed into German service. The first time we saw a T-34, we thought it was a mistake, that someone had painted a target tank incorrectly. Then it started moving. Our 37mm gun was useless. We hit it 5 times from 200 meters. Nothing. It turned its turret toward us, and we ran. 3 tanks in our platoon did not run fast enough. I saw the 76mm rounds punch clean through their armor, like it was cardboard. We learned that day, do not fight a T-34 unless you have no choice. The armor scheme forced German tanks into a terrible calculus. To destroy a T-34, you needed to close to 300 meters, 500 meters, for a side shot, or even closer for a frontal penetration, with the 50mm gun. But at that range, the T-34's 76mm gun could penetrate any German tank with ease. It was a mathematical equation that heavily favored the defender. The engine that would not die, while German tankers struggled with the T-34's armor. Their mechanics discovered an even more terrifying reality. The tank would not break down. German tanks were engineering marvels. The Panzer III and IV used precision-machined components, sophisticated transmissions, and carefully tuned engines. They required regular maintenance, skilled mechanics, and a steady supply of spare parts. In the steppes and forests of Russia, with supply lines stretching thousands of kilometers, and temperatures ranging from -40 degrees Celsius to +40 degrees C, German tanks failed constantly. The T-34 kept running. Soviet designers had built the tank around the V2 diesel engine, a 38.8-liter V12, producing 500 horsepower. Diesel was less flammable than gasoline, reducing fire risk when hit. The engine was deliberately designed for ease of maintenance and repair. Components were simple, rugged, and interchangeable. Tolerances were loose enough that parts would fit even when covered in mud or ice. The Christie suspension system, licensed from American designer J. Walter Christie, gave the T-34 unprecedented cross-country mobility. Wide tracks distributed weight across a larger surface area, preventing the tank from bogging down in mud or snow. The Soviets made the tracks even wider than Christie's original design, 500 mm, compared to 380 mm on German tanks. German tankers watched in frustration as T-34s drove through terrain that stopped their own vehicles cold. Mud that bogged down a Panzer III was merely an inconvenience to a T-34. Snowdrifts that required German tanks to find roads were crossed effortlessly by the wider Soviet tracks. Oberst Erich Schneider, commanding a Panzer regiment in Army Group Center, wrote in his December 1941 combat report, "Russian T-34 tanks operate in conditions where our vehicles cannot function. They cross swamps, forests and snowfields that would immobilize our entire regiment. When our tanks become stuck, we must abandon them, or wait for recovery vehicles. When Russian tanks become stuck, their crews simply back out, try a different route, and continue attacking. The operational advantage this provides cannot be overstated. The reliability extended to the tank's mechanical simplicity. German tanks used complex gearboxes that required skilled drivers and frequent maintenance. The T-34's 4-speed transmission was notoriously difficult to shift, requiring such force that drivers sometimes used hammers. But it rarely broke. German tankers might mock the crude individual T-34 superiority, would have meant little without numbers. What transformed the T-34 from a technical achievement into a strategic nightmare was Soviet industrial capacity. The factories that produced T-34, sir, were engineering achievements as impressive as the tank itself. The Kharkov Locomotive Factory, STZ, in Stalingrad, and Krasnoye Sormovo, in Gorky, operated on scales German industry could not match. When Germany invaded, these factories operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers slept beside production lines. Components were simplified to accelerate manufacturing. Anything that did not contribute directly to combat effectiveness was eliminated. Soviet designers reduced the T-34's production time from 8,000 man-hours per tank in 1941 to 3,700 man-hours by 1943. German factories required 12,000 man-hours to build a Panzer IV. The Soviets were not building better tanks, they were building 3 times as many tanks. When German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory in late 1941, they captured industrial centers. The response was unprecedented. Entire factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and evacuated east of the Ural Mountains. Production lines moved thousands of kilometers, were reassembled in Siberia, and resumed operations within months. The Kharkov facility, threatened with capture, relocated to Nizhny Tagil, and became Factory Number 183. By 1942, it was producing T-34s again. German intelligence could not comprehend the scale. Before the war, they had estimated Soviet tank production capacity at 1,000 vehicles per month. The actual number in 1942 was 2,000 per month. By 1943, Soviet factories produced 24,000 tanks. Nearly 16,000 were T-34s. Major General F.W. von Mellenthin, who served as a staff officer throughout the Eastern Front campaigns, wrote in his post-war memoir, Panzer Battles, "We destroyed Russian tanks at incredible rates. 10-to-1 kill ratios were common. 20-to-1 ratios were not unusual. It did not matter. For every T-34 we knocked out, 2 more appeared. We calculated that we had destroyed more Soviet tanks than they could possibly produce. We were wrong. The factories in the Urals were producing more tanks than our intelligence believed existed in the entire Red Army." German soldiers began reporting that knocked-out T-34s from morning battles would be replaced by new ones by afternoon. The sight of endless Soviet armor became psychologically crushing. Victory in a single engagement meant nothing when tomorrow brought fresh enemies in identical numbers. German engineers recognized the T-34 threat and responded with urgency. The Panzer IV was upgunned with a long-barreled 75 mm gun in 1942. The Panther tank, designed explicitly to counter the T-34, entered production in 1943. The Tiger, with its 88 mm gun and massive armor, was deployed to the Eastern Front. These were magnificent tanks. The Panther was arguably the finest tank design of World War II. The Tiger was nearly invulnerable to frontal attack. In individual engagements, German heavy tanks regularly destroyed multiple T-34s. But Soviet designers did not stand still. The T-34-85, introduced in early 1944, mounted a new 85 mm gun in a larger 3-man turret. The new gun could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther at combat ranges. The 3-man turret crew improved combat effectiveness dramatically, as the commander was no longer forced to double as a gunner. The suspension was improved. The armor was increased. The optics were upgraded. Most importantly, production continued without interruption. German factories struggled to produce 6,000 Panthers during the entire war. Soviet factories built 22,000 T-34-85s between 1944 and 1945 alone. Unteroffizier Karl Fawkes, a Panther gunner who fought at Kursk and later in Poland, recorded his experiences in letters that survived the war. "We thought the Panther would restore our advantage. For a few months it did. We could engage T-34s at ranges where they could not hurt us. We destroyed them by the dozen. Then we started seeing new T-34s, with bigger turrets and bigger guns. These could penetrate us frontally. Suddenly we were back to the old problem. They have more tanks, they can replace losses faster, and now they can kill us as easily as we kill them. The nightmare never ends. The Russians just build a better tank." German tactical advantages, better optics, better crew training, better radios, better tactical coordination, meant less and less as the war progressed. Soviet crews gained experience. Soviet tactics improved. Soviet support infrastructure became more sophisticated. And always, there were more tanks. Statistics rarely capture the experience of warfare. Numbers like 22,000 T-34s produced in 1,944 inches are abstractions. For German soldiers on the Eastern Front, the T-34 was not a statistic. It was the iron beast that appeared through morning fog, the target that would not die, the enemy that kept coming. German anti-tank crews learned to recognize the sound of T-34 engines. The diesel rumble was different from gasoline-powered German tanks. That sound meant you had seconds to prepare. If your position was good, if your gun was the new 75mm Pak 40, instead of the obsolete 37mm Pak 36, if the T-34 approached from an angle that exposed its flanks, you might survive. Often you did not. The psychological toll was documented in German medical reports. Soldiers who survived sustained T-34 attacks showed symptoms of combat fatigue and stress disorders at elevated rates. The knowledge that your anti-tank gun might bounce rounds harmlessly off enemy armor, that your tank might be penetrated before you could close to effective range, that destroyed enemies would be replaced by morning, created a sense of futility that traditional training could not overcome. Gefreiter Johann Danzer, an anti-tank gunner, who served with the 6th Army at Stalingrad and later survived Soviet captivity, gave testimony to American interrogators in 1946. The worst moment was not when T-34s appeared. We expected that. The worst moment was when we hit one squarely, saw the impact, knew it should be knocked out, and then watched it keep coming. Your brain cannot accept it. You've trained for years, you've aimed perfectly, you've fired at correct range, and the tank does not stop. Men broke. They ran. They refused to engage. Can you blame them? How do you maintain discipline when the weapons you're given cannot destroy the enemy? German commanders attempted to maintain morale by emphasizing tactical superiority, better training, and the courage of German soldiers. These were not lies. German tactical doctrine was superior. German crews were better trained. German soldiers often fought with remarkable bravery. But none of it mattered against simple mathematics. Superior skill and bravery cannot overcome a 3-to-1 numerical disadvantage when the enemy's equipment is at minimum equal to your own, and often superior. The T-34's nightmare impact on German forces extended beyond technical superiority. It revealed a fundamental flaw in German military doctrine that would prove fatal to their entire war effort. German armored doctrine, developed during the interwar period and proven in Poland and France, emphasized mobile warfare, combined arms coordination, and the concentration of force at decisive points. These principles were sound. They remained sound throughout the war. But German doctrine assumed technological and tactical superiority. The entire system was built on the premise that German tanks would be better than enemy tanks, that German training would overcome enemy numbers, and that German industrial capacity could sustain losses. The T-34 shattered all three assumptions simultaneously. When a German Panzer division encountered T-34s in 1941, commanders discovered their tanks were outclassed. When they destroyed those T-34s through superior tactics and flanking maneuvers, they discovered the Soviets had replacement tanks available immediately. When they requested better equipment from German industry, they discovered that production could not keep pace with combat losses. General Hermann Hoth, commanding the 4th Panzer Army during Operation Citadel in July 1943, submitted a report that captured German frustration. We achieved complete tactical surprise. Our lead elements penetrated Soviet defenses and destroyed significant numbers of tanks and guns. By all doctrinal measures, we should have achieved breakthrough. We did not. Soviet reserves appeared within hours. Fresh T-34 formations counterattacked our advancing units. Our forces, having expended ammunition and fuel in the initial assault, faced enemy numbers that exceeded our intelligence estimates. The operation stalled not because our tactics failed, but because Soviet material reserves made tactical success irrelevant. Kursk was the death knell of German armored warfare on the Eastern Front. Germany committed nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns to the offensive. The Soviets had over 5,000 tanks in the defensive sectors, with thousands more in reserve. German forces destroyed Soviet armor at favorable ratios, but could not achieve breakthrough. Within 2 weeks the offensive was abandoned. Germany never again launched a major offensive operation on the Eastern Front. The T-34 was not solely responsible for this defeat. Soviet artillery, anti-tank guns, infantry, and air power all contributed. But the T-34 represented something conceptually devastating to German military thought. It was proof that material superiority could overcome tactical excellence. This was anathema to German doctrine, which had always emphasized the triumph of skill and leadership over mere numbers. By May 1945, Soviet forces had produced approximately 84,000 T-34 tanks in all variants. This number exceeded the total combined tank production of Germany, Britain, and the United States. The T-34 represented 75% of all Soviet tank production during the war. German forces destroyed tens of thousands of these tanks. German technical superiority, when it existed, was real. Individual German tankers achieved remarkable kill ratios. None of it mattered. The factories beyond the Urals kept producing T-34s faster than German forces could destroy them. The final German defensive battles of 1944 and 1945 featured increasingly desperate measures. German forces used every tank, assault gun, and tank destroyer they could manufacture. They deployed the King Tiger, the most heavily armored tank of the war. They formed ad hoc units from training schools, using tanks that should have been instructional vehicles. They mounted anti-tank guns on any chassis that could carry them. Facing them were waves of T-34-85s, driven by increasingly experienced crews, supported by comprehensive artillery and air power, backed by seemingly infinite reserves. The mathematical inevitability that German commanders had recognized in 1943 became catastrophic reality in 1945. Oberstleutnant Hans von Luck, the Panzer commander, whose memoir captured the Normandy campaign's desperation, also fought extensively on the Eastern Front. His assessment of the T-34's impact was unsparing. We were better soldiers. We had better tactics. For most of the war, we had better tanks. We lost because the Russians had the T-34, and they had 80,000 of them. You cannot defeat mathematics. You cannot overcome industrial capacity with courage alone. The T-34 was not the best tank because of any single feature. It was the best tank because it combined good enough armor, good enough firepower, good enough mobility, and could be produced in numbers that made our victories meaningless. The T-34 was not a perfect tank. Its two-man turret was cramped and inefficient until the T-34-85 upgrade. Its optics were inferior to German equivalents. Its internal layout was awkward. Soviet crews suffered higher casualty rates than their German opponents in individual engagements. By pure technical measures, the Panther was a superior design. But the Panther could not be everywhere. The T-34 could. German soldiers feared the T-34 not because it was invincible in combat, but because it was inevitable in war. They could destroy it. They could outmaneuver it. They could kill its crew. And tomorrow, another would appear, and another, and another, until there were no more German tanks, no more German shells, no more German soldiers. The nightmare of the T-34 was not its armor, though that was formidable. It was not its gun, though that was deadly. It was not its mobility, though that was superior. The nightmare was the simple, undeniable reality that the Soviet Union could produce T-34s faster than Germany could destroy them, and that this mathematical certainty made German defeat inevitable regardless of tactical skill or individual courage. When German soldiers heard the diesel rumble of approaching T-34s in 1941, they felt concern. By 1943, they felt dread. By 1945, they felt nothing but the knowledge that they had already lost. The tank had not just defeated German armor, it had defeated German doctrine, German strategy, and ultimately, German hope. The factories beyond the Urals never stopped. The T-34s never stopped coming. And that, in the end, was the only thing that mattered.